Today we're going to get into solving quadratics, and we're going to do that by factoring. So we've been factoring, we just haven't been solving while we've been factoring. So one thing I want to talk about real quick before we get into it is called the zero product property. And that just means if we have some number times some number equaling 0, what must one of these numbers be? So if you have something times something, and that gives you an answer of 0, what must one of these numbers be? One of these numbers must be a 0. 0 times anything. 0 times 5. Does that give me 0? Yes, it does. Well, maybe this number will be the 0. And this one could be anything it wanted. Let's say it's 10. Does 10 times 0 give me 0? Yes. And maybe both numbers are 0. Does 0 times 0 give me 0? Yes. So the point I'm trying to make here is if you multiply two numbers together, or three numbers, or four numbers, it doesn't matter how many. If you multiply numbers together and you get an answer of 0, that must be because one of your numbers is 0. Either the first number is a 0, the second number is a 0, or maybe both of them are 0. So that's what this box is talking about. Our goal today is to get the problems factored. Once we have them factored, we're going to have something times something equaling 0. And so like we just saw over here, if something times something is 0, then one of the numbers has to be 0, either the first one, the second one, or maybe both of them. So we'll set the first thing in the parentheses equal to 0, and we'll solve that equation. And then we're going to set the second thing in parentheses equal to 0, and we'll solve that equation. And that's how we're going to do this once we get the problems factored. Okay, looking up here, I just wanted to remind you what the standard form of a quadratic equation looks like. Remember, a is in front of the x squared, b is in front of the x, c is the constant. But one thing that's new to us today, this side over here has to say equals 0. If our problem doesn't say equals 0, we are not ready to factor. Okay, so we're going to make sure that this side says equals 0, and then we're going to go from there. So let's just get down to it. Remember, when we're factoring, the first thing we always look for is a GCF. And then if we have two terms called a binomial, we're going to check for that difference of squares. And you don't have to write this down because I have it written on my board. But if you want to write it down, you're more than welcome. After we've checked for the GCF, we can check to see if the problem has three terms. That's called a trinomial. And if it does, then we're going to check our A times C rooftop. And when we do the A times C rooftop, we'll either have our shortcut or we'll have our long one. So that just depends. Okay, so several things going on today. First of all, we're going to have to make sure they say equals 0. Then once they do, we're going to factor using our strategies over here. Once we have the problems factored, then we're going to set each of the factors equal to 0, and we're going to solve those equations. And the reason I'm setting each of those equal to 0 is because of what I showed you over here. If something times something equals 0, then either the first thing in parentheses is 0, or the second thing in parentheses is 0, or maybe they're both equal to 0. Okay, let's read my directions. It says examples. Find the zeros of the following quadratic functions by factoring. Make sure the equations are in standard form first, which means make sure they say equals 0, and then also it means to make sure that the left side is in order. It starts with the x squared, then the x, then the constant. And then this part of the directions, when it says find the zeros, what other words mean the same thing as zeros? Solutions. What else we have? Roots, x-intercepts. if your directions say to do any of the following, find the zeros, find the solutions, find the roots, find the x-intercepts, they all mean the same thing. And the way we're going to do that today is by factoring. Okay, looking at the first problem. First of all, does it say equals 0? Yes. Does the left-hand side go in order? X squared, x constant. Yes. So we're good. So we're going to try to factor. First thing I always look for is a GCF. What's the greatest thing that will go into 2, 1, and 3? Nothing but 1. Do they all have x's? Nope. Okay, so there is no GCF. And then it's got 3 terms, 1, 2, 3. So since it's got 3 terms, then we're going to do a times c rooftop. So here I go. I take my a times my c. And what does a times c give me? -6. What do I want the numbers to add to be? This -1 that's in front of the x. So what two numbers do that? What two numbers multiply to be -6 that add to be -1? -3 and +2. Okay, can I do the shortcut or I have to do it the long way? I have to do it the long way. So I recopy my 2x squared. Instead of using the -1x, I'm going to use these two numbers. So I'm going to write a -3, follow it with an x. I'm going to use a +2, follow it with an x. And then I'm going to bring down my -3 that's in the back. I'm just going to ignore my equals 0 until the very, very end. Okay, this is when we start pulling out the GCF from the first two pieces. So what's the greatest thing that goes into those two pieces? X. And then we're left with x times what makes 2x squared? 2x. And x times what makes a -3x? A -3. Okay, let's look at our back two pieces. What's the greatest thing that will go into 2 and 3? Nothing but a 1. And then remember, I know whatever is here has to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and just write down 2x minus 3. And then I come back and decide what kind of 1 is it. And it's going to be a +1. That way +1 times 2x makes +2x, and +1 times -3 makes -3. Okay, now whatever is in both sets of parentheses, I write that down once. Whatever is left over, which is x plus 1, I write that down in the other set of parentheses. And now I'm done factoring. So now we're going to add the new part to this lesson, the equals 0. So I'm going to bring down the equals 0. This is what I was talking about earlier. If something times something equals 0, it's because one of these things is a 0. So it might be the first factor, it might be the second factor, or maybe it's both. So I'm going to take whatever's in the first set of parentheses, the first factor, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. I'm going to write the word or. I'm going to take the second thing in parentheses, the second factor, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve these two equations. So if I wanted to solve this equation for x, what would you do first? We would add 3 to both sides. That would give me 2x equals 3. And then what would you do? You would divide both sides by 2. And if you do that, you get an answer of x equals 3/2. X equals 3 over 2. And let's leave our answers as fractions. Okay, this second equation, what would I do to solve that? I would subtract 1 from both sides. And if I did that, I would get x equals -1. And those are my two answers. I get x equals 3/2 or x equals -1. So most of this is review. The whole factoring part is review. And if you've been struggling with factoring, then maybe today will be the day that the light bulb clicks for you. And then once we get it factored, we set our factors equal to 0, and we just solve those two equations. Okay, let's look at number 2. First thing I have to make sure is that the problem says equals 0. Does it say equals 0? No, it doesn't. So how can I turn this minus 15 into a 0? By adding it. So I'm not going to write it down below this time just to have more room to write. I'm going to write it up top. So I'm going to add 15 to both sides, because what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. Okay, on the right side, how much is negative 15 plus 15? 0. Okay, so that equals 0. The left-hand side, I have to make sure I put that in order. So I start with the highest exponent. So I start with the 2x squared, and then I'm going to go to the minus 11x, and then because I added 15, it's a positive 15. So you have to make sure it says equals 0, and you have to make sure your left-hand side is in order from highest exponent to lowest. Once it's that way, we start our factoring. So first thing I always look for is Mr. GCF. What's the greatest thing that will divide into 2, 11, and 15? Nothing but 1. They don't all have x's. Okay, so there's no GCF. I see it's got 3 terms, so I'm going to do a times c rooftop. So here I go. I take my a times my c, and what do I get if I take a times c? I get 30. What do you want them to add to b? Negative 11. So what two numbers multiply to be 30 that add to be negative 11? Negative 6 and a negative 5. Okay, can I do my shortcut here, or do I have to do it the long way? I have to do it the long way. Okay, so I recopy my 2x squared. Instead of using the minus 11x, I use these two numbers over here. So I write a minus 6, just put an x behind it. I write a minus 5, just put an x behind it. And I bring down the plus 15. And like the last problem, I'm going to wait to bring down that equals 0. Okay, looking at our first two pieces, what's the GCF? What's the greatest thing that goes into both of those? 2x. And 2x times what gives you that? X. 2x times what gives you a minus 6x? A minus 3. Okay, in the back, what's the greatest thing that goes into 5 and 15? 5. And then I know if this says x minus 3, what does this have to say? X minus 3. And then I come back and I decide what kind of 5 this has to be. And it has to be a negative 5. That way, negative 5 times x makes this negative 5x, and negative 5 times negative 3 makes that positive 15. Okay, then I take what's inside of those parentheses, I write it down once. I take what's left over, which is the 2x minus 5, and I write it down once. Now that I'm done factoring, I'm going to bring down my equals 0, and I'm going to actually solve. So I know if two things multiply to be 0, one of these things is 0. So I take my first factor, x minus 3, I set it equal to 0. I write the word or. I take the second thing in parentheses, 2x minus 5. I set that equal to 0. And now I'm going to solve these two equations. What would I do to solve this first equation? I would add 3 to both sides, which gives me how much? X equals 3. The other equation, what would you do to solve for x? First, you'd get rid of the minus 5 by adding 5. So that would give you 2x equals 5. Then what would you do to get rid of that 2? I would divide both sides by 2, and I get x equals 5 halves. I can't reduce it, so I'm just going to leave it like that, x equals 5 halves. And those are my two answers, x equals 3 or x equals 5 halves. What do you think? It's just more on top of what we've already been doing. It takes a while, I get it, I know it takes a while, but we've just been practicing the factoring for a while, and now we're just adding an extra step. Okay, number 3. First thing, it has to say equals 0, and so it doesn't. I'm going to move this 8x. How could I move a positive 8x? Subtract it. So I'm going to subtract 8x from both sides, 8x minus 8x makes 0. And then this side, I'm going to write it in order. So I'm going to start with the 16x squared, and then I'm going to just bring down the minus 8x. Okay, now I'm going to try to factor. So what's the first thing we always look for? A GCF. So what's the greatest thing that goes into both of these? 8x. Okay, build your parentheses. 8x times what makes 16x squared? 2x. 8x times what makes a negative 8x? A negative 1. I'm going to go ahead and bring down my equal 0. Now, let's look inside those parentheses. Now, I want to see if I can factor this. So first I look for a GCF. Is there anything that goes into both of those besides a 1? Nope. And then because it has two terms, I look to see if it's a difference of squares. It is a difference, but are these both perfect squares? No. So I'm done factoring. So now I'm going to set my factors equal to 0. So first I'm going to set my first factor, 8x, equal to 0. Write the word or. And then I'm going to take my second factor, 2x minus 1, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve these two equations. So first equation, if I want to get x by itself, how can I get rid of that 8? Divide by it. So I'm going to divide both sides by 8. 0 divided by 8 makes 0. As long as 0 is on top, 0 divided by anything is 0. Okay, this equation over here, what would you do to solve that? First, you'd add your 1. That makes 2x equal to 1. Then what would you do? I would divide both sides by 2, and that makes x equals 1/2. So my two answers are x equals 0 or x equals 1/2. And there it is. Okay. Let's go to number 5. So looking at number 5, I'm going to try to make this right-hand side a 0 here. So in order to do that, I have to move the 9x. So to move the 9x, what would we do? We would subtract it. So I'm going to subtract 9x from both sides. If I do that, 9x minus 9x makes how much? It makes a 0. And then on the left-hand side, I can't combine any of these, but I do need to make sure I put it in order. So I start with my highest exponent, so I start with the x squared. Then I go to the next highest exponent, so I'll go to the minus 9x. And then I'll go to the constant, the positive 18. So make sure it says equals 0, and make sure that it says highest exponent to lowest. Okay, first thing I always look for is a GCF. What's the greatest thing that will go into 1, 9, and 18? Nothing but 1. So then I look to see if I have I look to see if it's a trinomial or a binomial, and it's a trinomial, so we're going to go a times c rooftop. So what do you get if you take your a times your c? 18. What do you want them to add to be? Negative 9. And what two numbers do that? What two numbers multiply to be 18 that add to be negative 9? Negative 6 and negative 3. Bing, 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 bing. Okay, and then can I do the shortcut, or do I have to do the long one? Shortcut. Got the 1 in front. So I'm going to go x with a minus 6 behind it, and I'm going to go x with a minus 3 behind it, and then I'm just going to drop down that equals 0. So this one was nice because it was the shortcut. Those others that we did weren't. So now I know if two things multiply to be 0, that means one of these must be 0. So I take my first factor, x minus 6, and set it equal to 0. I write the word or. Then I take my second factor, x minus 3. I set it equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve these two equations. So to solve this equation here, what would I do? I would add 6 to both sides, and I would get x equals 6. I'm going to write my word or. What would I do to solve this equation? I would add 3 to both sides, and if I do that, what do I get? X equals 3. let's flip to the back page. And I have nothing on that back page. So let me flip over here. Okay, let's hop down to number 13. When I look at number 13, I see that this side over here doesn't say equals 0, so I have to make that happen. So first of all, how would you move a 14x? You would subtract it, so you would subtract 14x from both sides. That's okay. So then I have 3x squared minus 14x. And then I also have to move that pesky minus 11. I'll see you later.
Pesky?
Yep, that pesky minus 11. So how would I move that pesky minus 11? I would add 11 to both sides. And if I did that, that makes 0. And then I just have to bring down that plus 11. And then once it all says equals 0, then I'm just going to factor it like I normally do. So I'm not going to actually do it, but I would go through and I'd look for a GCF. And then if there isn't one, because it's a trinomial, I would do A times C rooftop. I do want to show you a couple more. I have a room full of people right now, so I'm sorry if I'm getting a little distracted. I'm going to ask somebody a question. Can I help you? Okay, let me do these two real quick, and then I will help you. Okay, number 14. Does it say equals 0? No, it does not, so I need to make sure that that says equals 0. So what would I do? I'd move the 49 by subtracting it, and I do have to subtract it from both sides. So 49 minus 49 makes how much? 0. And then this, I can't combine them, but I do have to put it in order. So I start with the 16x squared, and then I'm going to bring down the minus 49. Okay, so now I have to go through my factoring process. First thing I always look for is a GCF. Is there anything that will divide into 16 and 49 evenly besides a 1? No. Do they both have x's? No. So then I look to see, do I have a trinomial or a binomial? I've got a binomial, so I want to check for a difference of squares. Is it a difference? Yes. Are these both perfect squares? Yes. So this is the one that factors with a plus and a minus. What's the square root of 16x squared? 4x, so that goes here and here. And then what's the square root of 49? 7, so that goes here and here. And then now that it's factored, I drop my equals 0, and I solve. So I'm going to take my first factor, 4x plus 7, set that equal to 0. Then I'm going to take my second factor, 4x minus 7, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve these two equations. Why don't you take a second and see if you can solve these two equations, and we'll see what you get. Okay, so on the first one, what'd you get? You should have got a negative 7/4. First you would subtract the 7, you get 4x equals negative 7. Then you would divide by 4, and that makes x equals negative 7/4. On the other one, what would you get there? You should get a positive 7/4 because you would add the 7 to both sides, which would make 4x equals 7. And then if you divide both sides by 4, that would give you x equals a positive 7/4. Okay, I want to look at one more real quick. So looking at number 15, first thing I need to check out, does it say equals 0 over here? Yes, it does. Is the left-hand side in order from highest exponent to lowest? Yes, it is. So I'm ready to factor. First thing I always look for is a GCF. Do we have one? We do. The greatest thing that goes into 2, 24, and 64 is a 2. Do you notice that they all have x's? What's the greatest number of x's they all have? 1. Okay, I build my parentheses. 2x times what makes 2x cubed? X squared. 2x times what makes 24x squared? A 12x. And 2x times what makes a 64x? A 32. Okay, now I'm going to cover up my GCF and I'm going to try it all over again. So looking inside of my parentheses, do I have a GCF in here? I do not. Because it's got 3 terms, I'm going to do A times C rooftop. My A is a 1, so what do I get if I take A times C? I get 32. What do I want the numbers to add to be? Positive 12. And what two numbers multiply to be 32 that add to be 12? 8 and 4. Can I do the shortcut, or do I have to do it the long way? Shortcut. So it's going to go x with a plus 8, and it's going to go x with a plus 4. And then Mr. GCF, drop him down. Okay, all I have to do now is bring down my equal 0 and set all of these factors equal to 0 and solve. So first I'm going to set the 2x equal to 0. Then I'm going to set the x plus 8 equal to 0. And then I'm going to set the x plus 4 equal to 0. And I'm going to solve those three equations. So the first equation, what would you do to get x by itself? You would divide both sides by 2, and that would give you how much? 0. Second equation, what would you do? You would subtract 8 from both sides, and what would that give you? X equals negative 8. Third equation, what would you do to get x by itself? Subtract 4 from both sides, and what does that give you? X equals negative 4. Do you notice how we had 3 answers on this problem? Look at how the problem began. Do you see how the problem began with an x cubed, and we ended up with 3 answers? And these problems over here, how they started with an x squared, and we ended up with 2 answers? So whatever the highest exponent is, that's how many answers that we typically end up with. Okay, for you, for your homework, I want you guys to do the 7 through 12 section. So you've got these 3 and these 3, and you've got the rest of class to work on that. Thank you. Oh, smiley face. Oh, you can't see the smiley face? Smiley face.